Good afternoon. We are delighted to welcome you to our monthly Grand Rounds webinar, co-sponsored by the MGH Center for the Environment and Health and the MGH Institute Center for Climate Change, Climate Justice and Health. Our topic this month is the importance of trees for our climate and health, and public health and environmental justice in post-pandemic Chelsea. Next slide, please. I welcome Dr. Winnie Armand to introduce today's speakers.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very honored to be collaborating with Patrice and Sue Ellen from the IHP Center for Climate Change and Justice and Health. I am a physician in the Division of General Internal Medicine at MGH and am an associate director for the Center for the Environment and Health. I'm very happy to introduce our two speakers today who have very special places in my heart. Our first speaker I know personally, and so can attest to her dedication and to her work and commitment in making our world a better place. Dr. Pam Templer is a professor in the Department of Biology at Boston University. She majored in biology and environmental studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She received her PhD from Cornell University and completed her postdoctoral fellowship at UC Berkeley. She has published over 100 papers on a wide range of topics, including the effects of climate change and pollution on the health of forest ecosystems, as well as water and air quality for people. She's worked with the government, NGOs, and private sectors to help solve environmental challenges. She's received numerous awards for her teaching and scholarly work, and I'm really grateful for her in joining us today. I will also go ahead and introduce our second speaker before turning over the mic to Dr. Templer. Our second speaker does incredibly impactful work in the vibrant and diverse city of Chelsea, which is like my second home, as I'm honored to practice primary care there at Mass General's Health Center. Ms. Roseanne Bongiovanni is Executive Director of Green Roots, a community-based organization dedicated to improving the urban environment and public health in Chelsea and its surrounding communities. She has a Master's of Public Health from Boston University and is the recipient of numerous awards. She's a lifelong Chelsea resident and was a former city councilor. Among her accomplishments, Ms. Bongiovanni has led the transformation of vacant lands into parks, community gardens, and an urban farm. And she's led successful grassroots organizing campaigns to prevent the construction of a diesel power plant in Chelsea and managed million-dollar projects that have improved Chelsea's air quality. So I'm very honored to have both of these two distinguished speakers join us today to discuss important topics such as the trees, ecosystems, urban heat islands, COVID, and environmental justice. So I'm going to pass the mic to Dr. Templer. Thank you.
Thank you, Armand, so much. I'll start my slides. Okay, can you see that okay? Make sure I can see my chat in case any of you need to reach me. Here we go. Okay, great. Well, thank you, Dr. Armand and the others here today for having me. It is such an honor to be here with you today. As Dr. Armand said, I'm going to be talking to you about the importance of trees for our climate and health. And I just like to start my talk to say that I have no conflicts of interest related to the information I'm going to share with you today. So I've structured my talk today to share with you the importance of trees, first for climate change mitigation. Then I'll talk a bit about climate change adaptation, which some people call resilience. And then I want to end on a note about what can you do to get involved if this is a topic that's of interest to you. So first, climate change mitigation. This graph might be familiar to some of you. We know that because of human activities, such as the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation, we're seeing rising concentrations of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. This is leading to many different changes in our climate, including rising global temperatures. We see sea level rise, coastal flooding, droughts, heat waves, and more extreme wildfires these days. We also see in many high latitude ecosystems, such as New England, but also in Europe and Asia, that winters are warming faster than other seasons of the year, which is leading to a declining snowpack, which I'll come back to later in my talk. It's important to recognize that ecosystems around the globe can actually help us to mitigate climate change. And when we say mitigation, that just means using ecosystems as a way to offset the emissions that you and I put up into the atmosphere. So we know from a tremendous amount of work that carbon dioxide uptake by vegetation in ecosystems around the globe can offset approximately 30% of our current emissions of carbon dioxide. So what that means is if you look at this graph over here, the current concentrations of carbon dioxide on the planet on average are about 420 parts per million here in the year 2021. And it's thought without green space or forests or vegetation across our globe, our actual concentrations of carbon dioxide would likely be up around 600 parts per million, which we'd see even more extreme changes in climate than we already do. So how can forests act as a climate change mitigator? We know that many, though not all, ecosystems can act as net carbon sinks. So what does that mean? As forests, trees, and understory plants take up carbon dioxide during photosynthesis, they store that carbon in their biomass, so literally in the wood of their trees or their leaves and branches. Sometimes it goes down to their roots and then ends up in a long-term pool in soil. But we also know that every single day, carbon is also lost to the atmosphere during biological respiration. All organisms, whether you're a human being, a monkey, a plant root, or a microbe, you respire. And so as long as the net balance between photosynthesis and respiration is positive, meaning carbon in is greater than carbon out, we can view ecosystems as a net carbon sink that could basically pull CO2 out of the atmosphere and help us reduce climate change. Now, a number of years ago when I started working on this was such an academic exercise and you wouldn't see it in the news. But now you can't go a day without seeing some headlines. So for example, on the left in the Los Angeles Times, we have this article title called, "We already have carbon vacuums, they're called trees." And on the right, we have "Restoring Forests Could Help Put a Brake on Global Warming." Just recently, 2 weeks ago in the New York Times, we saw this headline, "Global Leaders Pledge to End Deforestation by 2030. And this was directly related to the recent climate change meetings that just ended in Glasgow, Scotland, COP26, also known as the Conference of the Parties. And the reason they were talking about deforestation is that a major goal of COP is to use nature-based solutions to help us mitigate climate change. This is happening on a more local scale as well. Many states across America have this, but because we're in Massachusetts today, I'll just note that Massachusetts has a 2050 Decarbonization Roadmap. It's a plan to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050. And this plan only works if we take into account carbon dioxide and other forms of carbon that can be sequestered by our natural ecosystems. On a more local scale, since we're based in Boston, I've just included some samples. There are many more for the greater Boston area. Of course, with Roseanne here, we have the city of Chelsea, we have Cambridge, the city of Boston, and Brookline, that many local towns and cities here again in Massachusetts and across the US have plans to mitigate their emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And we're really fortunate here in Massachusetts that we have the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, which does a lot of work to help coordinate at the regional scale. But one thing to keep in mind is that many of these plans that are relying on natural ecosystems to help offset human emissions of greenhouse gases is that they make a really big assumption that this arrow down, or the flux of carbon dioxide coming from the atmosphere into ecosystems, is going to stay steady over time. And one thing to keep in mind is that we know ecosystems are just like people. They have levels of health. They could be really healthy and functioning well, and they also can actually be damaged and not do so well. So some external factors that could potentially lead to declines in the net carbon sink for our ecosystems include things like extreme weather events. So a really hot spell can damage trees, water stress during drought, air pollution such as ozone, NOx, and particulates that we all emit to the atmosphere can damage trees, as well as land use change like urbanization when people cut down trees for development, and then the chronic warming temperatures that we see all the time. And so to address these changes, it's really important to understand what I said at the beginning, which is that winter is warming faster than other seasons of the year. These are just some headlines that were in the news locally in the last couple winters. There's been no winter this winter, and where is winter, snow, and cold? And we're seeing these kinds of headlines more and more. Of course, we get some anomalous years where maybe the Northwest gets a huge amount of snow or the Northeastern US gets a lot of snow. But in general, the long-term trend and what's continuing is that the winter snowpack in high latitude ecosystems where snow has just been a natural component of our ecosystems is expected to shrink over time. And why does that matter? You might be happy to hear that you won't have to shovel as much in the future, but I think it's important to recognize some of the consequences of this. So on the left, what I'm showing you is a forest ecosystem with a sufficient snowpack in winter. So it's a deciduous forest with the leaves drop during the winter time. We know that when we have a sufficient snowpack, it completely decouples soil temperatures from the air temperatures above it. So what do I mean by that? Any organism that lives below ground, whether you're a root of a tree or bacteria, fungi, or small mammal, if you have a sufficient snowpack above you, you're not going to feel the extremely cold temperatures, even on a very cold day in winter. That's in contrast to maybe a day that you and I consider mild. Maybe it's 30 degrees Fahrenheit. As long as the ground is not covered by snow and the air temperatures are below freezing, the soils are more likely to freeze. And we call this phenomenon colder soils in a warming world, so that as long as the areas of the globe that are below freezing in winter don't have snow on the ground, we're likely to see more soil freezing. The insulating properties of snow are not something that biologists discovered. Indigenous peoples around the globe have known for eons that snow is a wonderful insulator. But what we're increasingly recognizing, especially related to climate change, is that this shrinking snowpack can have consequences for the functioning of our ecosystems. So I'm just going to give you a couple examples of how our group at Boston University tries to look at this. I'll share with you just a couple quick stories, not a lot of data today. We conducted 2 snow removal experiments. One was at Hubbard Brook, and if you're not familiar with it, it's an experimental forest in the White Mountains in New Hampshire, where acid rain was first discovered in North America. We also do a lot of work at Harvard Forest, which is a 4,000-acre experimental forest located in Petersham, Massachusetts, and owned by Harvard University. In both places, we work in the dominant tree species stands, so sugar maple, American beech at Hubbard Brook, and red maple, red oak forest stands at Harvard Forest. And we conducted experiments over a 5-year period at both locations, similar to a physician researcher who's trying to do a clinical trial. In all ecosystem experiments, we always have to have a control, it's our placebo, and then we induce a treatment elsewhere. So in these experiments, we had plots where we did not touch the snow at all. And then we had a series of other plots, and this is just an example of one to give you a sense of scale, where we had at least 3 to 4 mature sugar maples at the center of each plot. And we made them large enough so we knew that the roots of these trees were mostly experiencing the conditions that we induced. So for these 5 years, for the first 4 or 5 weeks of winter, we literally had a team of students who would go in and shovel the plots. And then after that, they left the plots alone for the rest of winter. And we would simply go into all of the plots just to measure the depth of snow and soil freezing. And then we go back in the next growing season to measure the response of the trees. So in the picture on the left here is the same one I showed you earlier. The picture on the right is a close-up microscopic picture of a tree core. So maybe some of you are familiar with the fact that we can use tree rings to figure out the age of a tree. We can also sample the wood of a living tree, bring it back to the laboratory, and by measuring the precise width of the rings, we can look at growth rates of the trees, and then we can also chemically analyze them so we could figure out how much carbon dioxide the tree took up in order to form this amount of biomass. So just to give you a sense of what we measure and what we found, we have years here on the x-axis. We have cumulative amount of carbon that was sequestered by these forests. The upper line represents our reference or controls. So the fact that these values are increasing over time literally just means the trees were growing over time. And as they grow, they take up carbon dioxide during photosynthesis and they sequester that carbon in their wood. To our surprise, we found a really large decrease in how much carbon the forest was storing when we took away snow in winter and we induced soil freezing. So again, this upper line is just the trees that were in our control plots, and this lower line represents the trees that the only difference was they experienced less snow in winter and more soil freezing. We corroborated these results at the ecosystem scale by not only measuring how much carbon the trees took up, but again, it's really important that you also measure how much carbon is leaving by looking at rates of what we call stem respiration. This is literally how much carbon dioxide comes out of the wood of the trees. We also measure soil respiration. You can see this core on the ground here in our chamber, where we're measuring how much carbon dioxide is coming out of the soils as a result of respiration from microbes and roots and little animals that make their way below ground. So what we found overall with this study, again, is that if you have a smaller snowpack and increased soil freezing, it reduces the amount of carbon taken up and stored by trees. The mechanisms we found to explain this is that the soil freezing, which trees are not adapted to, damage the roots and reduce their ability to take up nitrogen in the next growing season. It also reduces their ability to take up water. And we also found below ground some pretty strong results that were surprising to us. We thought we'd see something, but not the degree that we did, where we found that a smaller snowpack and more freezing reduced bacteria, fungi, and insect abundance and diversity. So if I finish my talk right now, you might get a little depressed. And actually, when I used to finish my talk at this point, because this is where we were in the research, I'd often get the question, wait a minute, this is awful. Are all of our trees going to die? Why aren't they dead already? And actually getting that question a number of times really made our group think about the fact that winters are not the only season that's changing. We also know that summers, known as the growing season around here, are warming, and it's possible that the trees would do better in the summertime. So perhaps the negative conditions in winter could be offset by the warmer summer temperatures. So that caused us to set up what we call the climate change across seasons experiment, where we're currently looking at the combined effects of colder soils in winter, so soil freezing, and warmer soils in the growing season to see if they offset each other. Quickly, just a quick overview of how we're doing this experiment. This is only at Hubbard Brook in New Hampshire because of the high cost of infrastructure. In this experiment, we have 6 plots. This gives you a sense of our scale. We have 2 plots that are reference or controls. It's like the placebo for experiment. 2 plots that we warm 5 degrees Celsius or 9 degrees Fahrenheit in the growing season. 2 additional plots where we warm in the growing season and we take away snow in winter to induce soil freeze-thaw cycles. And I'll just show you one figure to give you a sense of the results that we're finding, especially related to carbon sequestration. In this particular study, instead of taking tree cores, which can disturb the trees, and we want this to be a long-term experiment, we're using what are known as dendrometer bands. These are bands that are spring held on the bole of a tree, the big woody biomass part of the tree, and we can measure the growth over time. So here I'm showing you, these are the reference trees, again, the trees that don't have any treatment, and it's the cumulative amount of carbon that they sequester in their woody biomass over time. So no surprise here, the trees are growing, which is a great thing. Now, when we compare the reference trees to the trees that have been experiencing warming temperatures, we see this really big increase in how much carbon they sequester, about a 50% increase. This is in line with what others predict, that with warming temperatures around the globe, our forests are going to grow, they're going to grow for a longer season, and perhaps they're going to take up more carbon. However, what we did that was new is we added this effect of taking away snow in winter and inducing freeze-thaw cycles. And we find that not only does the impact of taking away snow in winter offset about 2/3 of the warming-induced stimulatory effect, these differences are no longer significantly different. And so this is really important to understand, because if our models, which they are currently, assume that growing season warming is going to stimulate carbon uptake by our forests, our results show that if you don't take into account winter, you might be overestimating nature-based solutions to sequestering carbon in our forest ecosystems. So just to share with you other experiments that we conduct to try to understand what controls carbon sequestration in our forests. So as I said, we warm forests. We also create droughts in the forest. So this is a plot where we have troughs that basically divert 50% of the incoming precipitation. So every time it rains, 50% of the water comes off the plots. We also examine urban to rural gradients. So we have this gradient going from Boston out to Harvard Forest. And then we sample across cities to understand how urbanization itself affects carbon sequestration. And so far to date, our results demonstrate that the combination of warmer temperatures, smaller snowpack, droughts, and urbanization reduce the ability for our forests to store carbon, which is really important to understand as we move forward. So now I'm going to switch gears to climate change adaptation, and I'm actually going to move into cities. And you might ask, why am I now going to focus on the benefits of urban trees when I was just talking to you mostly about forests in rural New England? We know that urban areas represent only about 2% of global land area, but more than half of the human population lives in cities, and that number goes up to 83% in the United States. We know that urban street trees can provide many benefits, including improving street safety by creating a clear street edge, calming traffic and reducing road rage, improving drainage during flood events, filtering our air and reducing air pollution like particulates and ozone, As I said, they can also mitigate climate change by taking up carbon and reducing the amount of carbon dioxide we find in the atmosphere. And then a new topic I'm going to discuss now is how they can help humans adapt to climate change. We know that cities are warmer than their rural counterparts, and so just having a tree canopy can offset that urban heat island. It could also reduce temperatures during extreme heat events, which is really important because heat waves are the #1 climate-related cause of human mortality across the planet. And trees do this through both shading, which you're likely familiar with. If you stand under a tree canopy on a hot day, it's generally cooler than right outside of it. But they also cool local temperatures through evapotranspiration, which is just their process of taking up water and evaporating it through their leaves. We know that a small investment, relatively small, of $250 to $600 per tree can result in over $90,000 in benefit. And so what can you do if you want to contribute to greater tree canopy in your local area? I want to just start this by mentioning, I love the title of this Boston Globe article that said urban forests are crucial for combating climate change, but planting more trees is easier said than done. And so my point here, if any of you are interested in getting into tree planting efforts, is that it's really important to keep in mind that we can't just plant them and walk away. We need to care and protect them, just like we would if we were concerned with someone's health, a human being. And so what can you do if you want to help increase tree canopy cover, whether it's in a forest or in the city? I would say get involved, especially in cities and neighborhoods that don't have trees. We know we have a huge amount of disparity, both across cities and within neighborhoods, within cities themselves, that some areas have really high canopy cover, some have really low canopy cover, and that's directly related to both race and socioeconomic status. I'd say that where you get involved in maintaining trees, really look into how are they going to be maintained? Are they going to be irrigated? We know that most trees die within their first 2 years of life if they're not taken care of, especially because of watering. We know they can be killed by pest species as well as gas leaks. In a city like Boston with really old infrastructure, we have a tremendous amount of methane leakage, which could actually kill trees by basically suffocating their roots. I would say if you want to get involved, I don't think you have to do this on your own. You're always welcome to, but I would say use the energy and infrastructure that's provided by others and get involved and find out where you can be most helpful. So for example, there's often local tree planting committees that already have efforts underway in an organized way. And if they're not organized, get involved and offer to help with that. I would say partner with non-governmental organizations. Locally, we have Mothers Out Front, which is actually a national organization, Speak for the Trees, and Green Roots, which I'll let Roseanne talk about in more detail. But I would say in all of these, they're wonderful resources, and many of them are already making efforts with tree planting, and you could augment the work that they're already doing. And finally, I'll just end with a brief description of how you might want to partner with a local university. Here in Boston, we're so fortunate because we have many universities and colleges and an eager student body wanting to help save the world. I'll give you one example. At Boston University, we have the Urban Program, which trains PhD students in biogeoscience, environmental health, and statistics to help them develop collaborative, solution-oriented projects with policymakers, non-governmental organizations, and the private sector, all at the interface of air, water, and climate. These are just some examples of organizations we've been working with, and we're always eager to work with more. And so just to give you an example of what our students actually do, I'll just briefly talk about 4 of them. Jessica Wright worked with the City of Cambridge City Council to help them identify methane leaks so they could help reduce greenhouse gas emissions of this greenhouse gas. Kate Connolly worked with Energize Andover, a town in Massachusetts during the peak COVID time to help them measure carbon dioxide concentrations in their classroom, because that's a great measure of ventilation to help them identify when it was safe for students to return to school. Raquel Jimenez worked with Speak for the Trees in Boston to help identify areas across the greater Boston area where trees could be better planted in an equitable way. And Taylor Adams worked with Quant AQ to help them develop more cost-effective air quality sensors. So I'll just end by saying it's really great to be with all of you. And if any of you are interested in learning more about this topic or want to collaborate or get involved, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'd be happy to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Templer. That was such an amazing presentation. And now I'll hope to bring it locally to Chelsea, which is just outside of Boston, and talk with you a little bit about how we see trees impacting local health here in Chelsea, as well as environmental justice more generally. So my name is Roseanne Bongiovanni. I'm the Executive Director of Green Roots, and I would like to disclose that I have no conflicts of interest with any of the companies relevant to this talk. Next slide, please. Green, one before maybe. I move a little slowly. There you go. Thank you. Green Roots is a resident-led organization working to engage and empower the most impacted residents in Chelsea and East Boston. Together, we implement innovative campaigns and strategies to achieve environmental justice, social justice, and improved public health. Next slide, please. While we often think about Massachusetts as one of the most progressive states in the nation, we should also recognize that we're not doing so well when it comes to environmental justice. In 2016, the Center for Effective Government, which is now called the Project on Government Oversight, graded only 2 states in the nation a failing grade for citing toxic facilities within 1 mile of where low-income residents of color live compared to white non-poor areas. In Chelsea and East Boston, we're living this reality every single day. Next slide, please. Chelsea is Massachusetts' smallest community at 1.8 square miles, and our census counts say that we're close to 45,000 residents, though we know that that's an underestimation of the number of folks who live here, but don't necessarily participate in the census because of immigration status. But of our residents, 73 of our counted residents, 73% identify as ethnic and racial minorities, and 24% low below the poverty levels. That's pre-pandemic, and we know the pandemic hit our community extremely hard, and so those numbers might actually be higher in terms of poverty levels. In neighboring East Boston, it's at 5 square miles, but again, very densely populated because much of East Boston is taken up by Logan International Airport. About 3 square miles is taken up by Logan. About 55,000 residents call East Boston home, and 53% of those residents identify as Latinx. It's the most significant or most prominent Latinx community or neighborhood in all of Boston, and about 17% pre-pandemic, again, of the residents live below the poverty line. Next slide, please. Along the banks of the Chelsea Creek, we are really storing so much of all of New England's regional heating and industrial needs. And so it's really a case of the unequal distribution of environmental burdens and public health burdens. So this is where we see very clearly environmental injustice and environmental racism. This is a picture of the Chelsea Creek as seen from East Boston. So it's the Chelsea Creek with these tanks in front and Chelsea just behind it. The Chelsea Creek waterfront is home to 100% of the jet fuel that's used at Logan International Airport and 70 to 80% of the region's heating fuel, as well as gasoline for hundreds of gas stations throughout all of the mid-Atlantic. You can see a power plant in the background and other industrial activities in neighboring Everett, which also impacts Chelsea and East Boston's health. Next slide, please. The Chelsea Creek is also home to massive road salt piles, which provide road salt in the winter months for de-icing for over 350 communities in New England. Next slide, please. This is the New England Produce Center. It's one of the largest privately owned produce distribution warehouses in the entire nation. This center sees upwards of 37,000 truck trips annually coming into and out of the produce center. And much of what you see are trucks that are not roadworthy, so they're using that back storage space essentially, or back compartment for additional storage space as the produce center has grown over the years. So just a few short years ago, you would see over 100 of those storage reefer units, they call them, running on running on some of the worst, highest level sulfur diesel fuel 24 hours a day, every single day of the year. Next slide, please. We heard Dr. Templer talk about the importance of trees, and this is very real here in Chelsea. Within our 1.8 square miles, 80% of our city is impervious. So concrete, asphalt, hardscape. Meanwhile, only 4% of our entire city is public green space, and only 2% is covered by tree canopy. And this is despite multiple efforts at significant tree planting. Just today, we celebrated the 2400th tree being planted in Chelsea together with the City of Chelsea, Green Roots, and the DCR's Greening the Gateway program. Despite those intensive efforts, we're still well below the national average and recommendations for tree canopy covers. Next slide, please. It's no surprise that Chelsea and East Boston have some of the worst pollution rates and public health statistics in Massachusetts. Chelsea residents face nearly double the risk of respiratory illnesses from air pollutants and 1.5 times the risk of cancer compared to the rest of Massachusetts. Again, no surprise that when the proponent of Cape Wind was proposing clean, renewable energy for Nantucket, where was he proposing a dirty diesel power plant? None other than an environmental justice community. Right on the banks of our Chelsea Creek waterfront and right next to the only elementary school in Chelsea where 4 schools are housed. This is the daily reality that Chelsea residents and other residents in environmental justice communities like Chelsea and East Boston have to be vigilant to stop the egregious proposals that continue to threaten our public health and our environment. Next slide, please. It's no surprise that Chelsea and East Boston got slammed by COVID. We were on display for the whole world to see as the epicenter of the first outbreak. Chelsea had 6 times the state of Massachusetts rates of COVID infection, and we were, again, all over the news for everybody to see. We have said for many years that Chelsea and East Boston would be hit first and worst. Well, we thought that would be a climate-related event. We never foresaw a pandemic hitting our community, but it did slam us in some of the worst ways possible. Next slide, please. But what we do in communities like Chelsea is we have resident-led solutions, and this is an example of which. Almost immediately before, as we were seeing the pandemic sort of unfold in New York City, Chelsea collectively came together through the Chelsea Pandemic Response Team. We started over 65 days of consecutive calls with over 75 stakeholders and 10 working groups working diligently every single day to implement resident-led solutions to address these concerns within our community. We started the One Chelsea Fund, which raised $1.4 million, raised and distributed $1.4 million in cash assistance to residents impacted by COVID in Chelsea. You can see some of the letter stuffing that we were doing at my kitchen table. Next slide, please. There are more than 15 pop-up food pantries throughout all of Chelsea and mutual aid efforts that began and are still underway in East Boston. And much of those pop-up food pantries are still continuing today, still with blocks-long lines of folks who are food insecure. Next slide, please. Green Roots Urban Farm is really a respite for outdoor space and outdoor activity and social connectivity, but it also played a critically important role during the pandemic and continues to do so. Over the course of the last 2 growing seasons, this urban farm produced over 5,000 pounds of fruit and produce and herbs that was donated to food insecure families and food pantries throughout all of Chelsea. And we also connected with other larger farms that aren't in Chelsea. Gaining Ground Farm in Concord helped to provide over 25,000 pounds of food to food pantries in Chelsea and East Boston over the last 2 growing seasons. Next slide, please. Green Roots is really proud of this report that we just recently published, which outlines how our intersecting social determinants of health have shown that Chelsea would be one of the communities most vulnerable to COVID-19 and most vulnerable to any other major health and climate disaster. And this report also outlines a number of policy recommendations that need to be taken now. We need bold action now to make sure that the impacts of public health and health disparities don't continue, that our trajectory is actually better than it was pre-pandemic, that we're addressing these significant environmental and public health concerns moving forward. You can get a copy of this report on our website at www.greenrootschelsea.org. Next slide, please. Well, the statistics are quite bleak in Chelsea. we know what we know best, and we know how to come together as a community to implement resident-led solutions, to organize and to fight back, and to take public health and environmental concerns right into our own hands. And that's what we're doing with Green Roots. We have multiple community-led initiatives underway, including working intensively to increase vaccine distribution and vaccine equity in our community, increase information, and inform folks against misinformation, and just connect with folks to make sure they're getting critical care at institutions like MGH, and that we're continuing to build trust in the community. Next slide, please. We're working to address urban heat islands. We're partnering with Boston University School of Public Health to monitor our health and our heat island impacts here in Chelsea. These yellow dots show our our air quality and temperature sensors throughout the city of Chelsea and the neighborhood of East Boston. And we're comparing that data with the National Weather Station located at Logan International Airport. Together with this information, if you could just click, we are working to implement a cool block solution. So we've taken a neighborhood level approach, identified a number of areas that are hot in this neighborhood, and work to implement different strategies. So we're focusing on this neighborhood right now, which has the Chelsea Boys and Girls Club in it. And what we're doing is we're working to implement a white roof, or put in place a white roof on the Boys and Girls Club, while doing massive tree planting all around this block and transforming a vacant piece of property that is right now just hardscape into a lush new green space. And we're doing pre and post monitoring to show the effects and the positive impact of this cool level approach, so that this can be a replicable model moving forward to address heat island impacts, not only in Chelsea and East Boston, but even nationwide in other environmental justice communities like ours. One more click, please. Throughout the pandemic, we also focused very intensively, I know you might frown, that water fountains were dissuaded from being utilized, but as we were seeing people standing in these blocks long lines for food and extreme heat, we recognize that hydration is a significant concern in our community. And so throughout our community, there were really very few water fountains at all. And so what we did is we partnered with the City of Chelsea, Boston University School of Public Health, and a number of different private foundations to raise funds to implement these hydration stations throughout the city. Now there are over 9 hydration stations throughout all of Chelsea where folks can go and drink out of the fountain, but also fill up a water bottle. And what we're trying to do is make sure that folks have the opportunity to be hydrated, especially in these extreme temperatures. This past summer and coming up in the spring of 2022, we'll also be increasing our misting stations. We purchased these hydration stations with an adapter so that we could create misting stations to provide more cooling effects and sort of attractions for folks in the community, and a respite really from the extreme heat that we're experiencing in our communities. Next slide, please. We're also addressing the serious air pollution concerns in our community. We were successful in advocating for the first stationary air quality monitor. That's what you see behind that fence in this picture here. It took years and years and years of advocacy, but now we have one stationary monitor in Chelsea that is telling us accurate data on our air quality. We also have 9 mobile monitors throughout the city. And you heard Dr. Templer talk about QuantAQ. We're partnering with folks at QuantAQ and Boston University School of Public Health to increase air quality monitoring in Chelsea, but not only to have that air quality monitoring be underway, but to take that information in a very easily accessible way that is translatable to community members so that they can see it in real time, understand it, and be able to develop advocacy and policy tools, but also to be able to think about personal actions. Do I want to go out and take a run while the air quality is really poor in Chelsea? And so we're coupling this outdoor air quality monitoring with an indoor air purification or improvement project where we're installing over 200 air purifiers throughout all of Chelsea, again, partnering with Boston University and MGH, sort of prescribing indoor purifiers or indoor air quality purifiers for folks who are challenged by respiratory and cardiovascular disease. We're working to see if these indoor purifiers really do improve the quality of life and the health of residents in our community. And so we'll couple this indoor and outdoor advocacy and implementation project with really a larger effort to address air quality holistically in Chelsea and East Boston. Again, another replicable model that other communities can take and implement in their own communities. Next slide, please. One of the things I'm most excited about is this our work on food justice and food insecurity. So this is our urban farm, which is really a wonderful and magnificent place and is really addressing food insecurity and land sovereignty here in Chelsea. We were just awarded a pretty significant grant from Mass General Brigham to create a teaching kitchen and garden center that's attached to this urban farm. And so essentially folks can come, learn how to grow in this urban farm and adjacent community garden, and take what they've grown and bring it over to the teaching kitchen, make meals together and learn how to eat healthy, cook healthy. And also, if they're interested in starting a business, we'll have a workforce development person to help, especially with those folks who are cooking in their own kitchens and sort of selling it. We'll help those folks to gain real workforce skills to grow their business and to be entrepreneurs here in Chelsea and to help sustain themselves financially. So it's really a win-win all around. It's addressing food insecurity concerns, it's bringing community together, it's breaking down social isolation, but it's also helping to help folks be more financially solvent and stable as we move out of this pandemic. Next slide, please. We're always working to achieve greater public access and green space to our waterfront. And so this is an example of a community-led process where we're creating a new park, a new open space along the Mill Creek. We're doing this really up and down the entire Chelsea Creek waterfront to try and increase the amount of open space. So I'm hoping that in a year's time, if I was back on this panel, I might say that Chelsea's open space is now 6% instead of 4%, and that our tree canopy cover is 4% instead of 2%. It's always the goal to continue to bring new open space to Chelsea. Next slide, please. I'll just end saying that Green Roots takes bold action. We're not always the favorite organization in the room necessarily. We're not afraid of shying away from controversy and pressing folks to take bold action, but that is really what's needed to achieve environmental justice in Chelsea, in East Boston, in other communities in Massachusetts, and really nationally. And I hope that you'll consider following us on our social media feeds and clicking on our website for that COVID-19 report. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak today and for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Roseanne and Pam. You guys are inspirational. I learned so much from you, and I know our guests have too. I have a ton of questions for you, and I welcome the audience to put their own questions into the Q&A, and we can try to get to them. I have a question to start. Actually, it's for both of you, and maybe I'll direct it first to Roseanne, and then Pam, you can follow up with your thoughts. I'm curious, Roseanne, for Green Roots, when you planted all those trees, how did you get guidance on what trees to plant? And then I'm wondering, Pam, I'm thinking about how it's so much more complicated than probably just planting a tree in terms of, like, I was recently reading that trees themselves can be methane sources, thinking about pollinators, thinking about what's resilient, what's native. So Roseanne, if you could describe what your organization did, and maybe that could be a guidance for the rest of us. And then Pam, if you could speak to that as well.
Sure. So in Chelsea, we have this great partnership between the City of Chelsea and the Department of Conservation and Recreation. Several years ago, when there was an infestation of, I don't even remember the name of the bug that sort of wiped out a number of trees. I'm sure Dr. Templer remembers that pest. They started this Greening the Gateway program, and it was really meant to rebuild and replant our tree canopy cover in a number of different areas. And so with the Greening the Gateway program, they're really tree experts. And so they've come out and partnered with us and said, this is the sort of menu, if you will, of trees that are available and that are recommended for this urban environment in this challenging growing space. And so you can choose from this sort of menu of options of trees. And we partnered with the Department of Public Works to dig out those tree pits and to get community members to adopt those trees, if you will, and to care for them once they're planted. So we're really coupling community with city and the state to have this perfect marriage of tree planting and tree care long term.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that great question. I'll just add, I thought what Roseanne said was great. And I'll just add that many towns and cities have tree wardens, and they're a wonderful resource of information. As Roseanne just said, it's really important to know what trees are going to survive. And what we thought would survive 30 years ago is very different than our current understanding. Now that suddenly we're seeing much more severe extreme heat events in summertime, which causes water stress for the trees. And other things. I'll also say it's really important to think about wherever you live across the world that there are local programs. So for example, in some towns, just planting trees in public spaces isn't enough to achieve climate goals or tree canopy cover. So in some localities, you can actually request that the town or city you live in plant a tree on your private property, and they'll often cover the cost. So I think it's important to team up with wonderful organizations like Green Roots, but also if you look around your own yard, if you have that space, it's possible to plant trees, and you would get guidance from your local town or city on that.
And that actually tag teams really well to one of our attendees' questions about whether there are specific organizations that our businesses can support, like an Adopt a Tree program. I know, Pam, you mentioned some of the organizations that are very active in the space, like Mothers Out Front, Green Roots, but are there any others in this New England area that you can think of that we could support?
I'd highly recommend connecting with Speak for the Trees. I saw in the chat that great question about adopting a tree. They actually have a program, and it's really clever because they allow you to adopt a tree, and then you can go maintain it by adding water, irrigating it, and then you could follow its growth online. So it truly is an adoption process where you can follow the survivability of that individual tree that you're helping to grow. And so Speak for the Trees, they do a lot of other great work related to tree planting. They've brought in a lot of youth, so high school students, to help them with their efforts, to give them training opportunities, as well as, again, to promote tree planting in areas that haven't historically had it.
Great, thank you. I have another question for both of you, and I'm curious about your perspective, and maybe Pam, we can start with you on this one, and Roseanne, I'm curious what your thoughts are. I remember Pam saying once that the majority of the trees are, that if you look at the globe, our country, excuse me, the majority of the trees are on private property. And that as people become more suburban, as they move out of the cities and go into the suburban towns, that is having an impact on basically our carbon sinks, right? So that really struck me because it made me think that, okay, so really we want our society to be in these densely packed cities, but then I hear about Chelsea and how little green canopy there is, and how do you balance those tensions?
That's a great question and a tough one. So here in the Northeast, with our history of land ownership, most of our trees are on private land. If you go to the Western United States, it's the opposite. So most of the tree canopy is on public lands, like state parks, national parks, things like that. So here in the Northeast, New England right now is something as a whole, about 80% tree cover, which is huge for the United States. We're also the most populated region, yet most of our tree cover is on private land, as you mentioned. So if we want to protect it, especially during economic downturns, when I couldn't fault somebody for cutting down a tree for money that they need in their retirement, we need to do more to protect the trees and give incentives and help people financially to preserve the trees on their property. That doesn't help places like Chelsea, where they don't have enough tree canopy to even preserve. And so I am just so pleased that there's so much more attention being placed on Green Roots and other organizations that are saying, wait a minute, it's great to preserve this, magic 80% number, but you got to increase it where the people are living, because they're the ones who are going to benefit from it. So I think we really need to start local and put more effort, not just into individual towns and cities that people live in, but helping each other out because of these huge amounts of disparity across regions like the greater Boston area.
Yeah, I would say in Chelsea, what we recognized throughout the pandemic was, a lot of folks were encouraged a lot of folks were going outside to parks and outdoor spaces, right, to get a bit of a relief from being indoors all the time. In Chelsea, our parks were really shut down, and so few neighborhoods have that tree canopy cover. And yet, as we're starting to see ourselves come out of the pandemic, we're seeing developers come in and try to scoff up, right, the small parcels of land that are available and up zoned, really maximize their development. So they're building on every square inch of a parcel of land. And so what we've said in Chelsea is, hold on, stop what you're doing. Like, let's think long-term. Let's not just think about the economic needs of our community now by bringing in more tax revenue. Let's think about the long-term impacts. If we're maximizing every parcel of land by building it out and eliminating that open space, what are we doing for the long-term public health impacts? What are we doing long-term for our climate impacts in the city? It's going to cost us more money long-term. And so let's not just think about dollars now. And so we've essentially stopped our city from upzoning, meaning maximizing every single inch of a parcel. And we've said, let's prioritize open space. So those side yards, the backyards, the trees on private property, so that we can increase the green space, the tree canopy cover throughout our entire community, which will help our public health, it'll help our mental health, it'll help our climate health. And so really thinking long-term about the benefits of open space and green space and trees on private and public property.
Thank you guys both. One of our participants wants to know if there's any kind of support for living roofs. So do either of you have any experience residential, but this is something I think as a hospital too would be great to incorporate. What are your thoughts on that?
You want to go first, Pam? Yeah, go for
Yeah,
it.
I'll be honest, I don't know a lot about it, but what I do know is that it's a wonderful thing. So at Fenway, there's a rooftop garden. At Boston University, we now have a rooftop garden. I know at BU School of Medicine now has a rooftop garden. So I'm sorry I don't have the details, but I would say they're a wonderful resource to have basically co-benefits of providing food, also decreasing the albedo or the, increase, changing basically the energy balance of a roof. And so I would encourage people who want to get involved with that to do that, because it's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, I would say something similar. We're really excited about living roofs. The difficulty or challenge in Chelsea is that a lot of the buildings are old and it's structurally, not feasible to have some of these living roofs, or it's economically infeasible to have these green roofs. And so we've moved towards the white roof approach, though ideally, we'd prefer to have green roofs over white roofs because the benefits would be so much greater.
I think also we run into these difficulties too when a lot of our off-site buildings are not owned by us, they're rented. It sounds like a great idea for a project for funding if the other people out there at different organizations have access to funds to pilot that. And I would love to hear, circle back to us and let us know how that goes. Somebody has mentioned something about the rain gardens, and the Chelsea map showed that 2 of them needs restoration. Do you know anything about that, Roseanne?
Sure, yes. So we've implemented a number of rain gardens over the past 10 or so years. And we're excited about those rain gardens, but they need maintenance just like everything else. And so there's often money for implementation of projects and often not enough money for operations and maintenance. And so those rain gardens were installed about 11 years ago. And so they do need some restoration and love. There's a lot of sediment that has built up. And so they do need some attention. So great rain gardens, we're continuing to increase the use of rain gardens and implementation really throughout the entire community. But now that we have the experience, we recognize that you can't just raise the money for the implementation without that long-term investment and maintenance.
One of our attendees was curious about the economic benefit, making an argument for green space. And I think, Pam, one of your slides, you had some numbers in terms of the benefit from small investment, and maybe you could speak more about that. And I think our attendee was specifically interested if there was any scientific evidence about the financial benefits from the mental health benefits of having green space.
Sure. Yes. So I don't study this personally, but we know from many publications that proximity to green space can definitely provide some restorative health benefits. We know, for example, kids who are in schools that are even just have a tree outside the window they can look at, let alone just getting to play in that tree, can have huge outcomes on their learning abilities and their test scores. We know that green space, it could raise property values. So that's a new revenue source for a city or town, just literally having more canopy, because it not only makes it more comfortable on extremely hot days, but is just visually, some people consider more aesthetically pleasing. So absolutely, there are many financial benefits to having more trees where possible.
Absolutely. I think there was a question about what is a rain garden. And so a rain garden is essentially, an open space that is collecting rainwater, and it's preventing all of that rainwater from sheet flowing into storm drains or off into a water body. It's essentially filtering and maintaining some of that water to water the plants. It's a healthy green sort of alternative to just, maybe just a lawn, right?
And Lisa has a great question about these ideas and how do you sustain them? How do you, once the initial funding for a project is there, how does one then continue to maintain these projects in the long run?
Really challenging. It's definitely a big concern of ours. And so what we've done is we try to partner with the city or with private entities. So I'll take, for example, we recently built a new park in Chelsea that's really dynamic and spectacular. And so we raised the initial investment to build this park. And then we partnered with the city and with a private developer that's adjacent to the park. And so we have this agreement that the day-to-day maintenance is done by the city of Chelsea through the Department of Public Works, and that's the reverse. The day-to-day is done by the adjacent property owner. They go out and clean the trash, and they might mow the grass, and then the bigger equipment that's more costly is covered by the city of Chelsea. And so they'll go in and occasionally replace those play structures. And so it really is a case-by-case basis. And ideally, we'd like to find partners in all of our projects. On the flip side, we restored an acre of salt marsh in Chelsea, which is, a drop in the bucket, right? In communities like the Cape or in Canada, where there are large swaths of salt marsh. In urban communities, there are very small amounts or low acreage of salt marsh, but they're very costly to restore. And so we raised, something like $1 million to restore an acre of salt marsh, and we celebrated the restoration of that salt marsh. But after 10 or 15 years, with no maintenance, it's almost back to being where it was beforehand. And so, again, you have to partner with public and private institutions, some that have resources, and some don't have the same commitment. So it's always vigilance and a dogged approach to, continue to push for those agencies to help maintain these vital green spaces.
I know we're getting close to the end of the hour, but I just have this dying question, which I really don't want to put you on the spot, Pam, but with the holidays coming up, Christmas trees, what are your thoughts about that? Any guidance on best ways to go about Christmas trees, or to just skip Christmas trees?
Oh, I won't go there, but I will just say that many areas, Christmas trees could actually have benefit because they're an area, depending on what was there before, right? If you're going to start with a pristine forest that's growing and is healthy, I would say don't support, a Christmas tree farm that is cutting down that forest to grow Christmas trees. But many of these Christmas tree farms have actually been around for generations. And if you think about it, they're pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. Anytime you see wood, if you're walking down the street and you see a tree, or you look in your house at your Christmas tree, that has wood, and that wood is 50% carbon. So you've basically contributed to carbon dioxide being pulled out of the atmosphere. Now the question is, what do you do with that Christmas tree afterwards? So if you're able to compost it rather than sending it to the dump, that's a great way to return carbon into a more long-term sink, because it becomes part of mulch and compost that people can use in their gardens. That could actually, some of that carbon will go below ground and be stored for a long period of time. So that's all in there.
Thank you. Thank you. Roseanne, any thoughts about Christmas trees?
No, I'm glad you gave that one to Pam.
It was so great to have both of you. It was an enormous amount of information, and I think we'll have to have you guys back again in the future. I don't know if Patrice, you want to, are you free to turn on your camera and mic? And if you want to say anything about also, I think your announcement in the last couple of slides.
Thank you, Winnie. Our next webinar is December 15th. with Dr. Samuel Smith, focusing on minimizing anesthesia's impact on the environment. And then we're excited to welcome Bill McKibben, founder and senior advisor emeritus of 350.org, a climate pioneer since the 1970s, author of books, multiple books translated into multiple languages. He will be the keynote speaker on April 9th, 2022 for our annual symposium, Climate Change and Health, Roadmap for Grassroots Advocacy, a virtual symposium. We'll also welcome Representative Lauren Underwood from Illinois, who has co-sponsored the Black Momnibus bill legislation of 2021, along with Senator Markey and other co-sponsors of the bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us. This is great.
Yes, thank you. Have a
Thank
lovely
you,
day.
guys. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Nice to see you all.